There comes a point in a man's life when peace stops feeling like a luxury and starts feeling like the only thing worth protecting. Most people do not understand that about older men. They look at a man like Michael and assume he gave up on love, that maybe life disappointed him one too many times, or that he simply became too guarded to let anyone in. But that is not what happened. The truth is quieter than that, and a lot more honest. Michael did not stop believing in connection because he became cold. He stopped chasing it because he finally learned how expensive unrest can be. In his 30s, he thought relationships were where meaning lived. He believed closeness was always worth the effort, worth the compromise, worth the emotional weight that came with trying to make two lives fit together. And for years, he carried that belief like a rule he was never supposed to question. But age has a way of showing a man what excitement often hides. It shows him the sleepless nights, the tension in his own home, the constant need to explain himself, the slow exhaustion that comes from calling chaos love just because it once felt passionate. Now, at 62, Michael sits in a quiet house with his coffee, the morning light falling across the kitchen table, and for the first time in years, nothing in him feels pulled apart. No pressure, no performance, no emotional noise humming in the background, just stillness. And once a man discovers what that kind of peace feels like, he does not walk away from it lightly, not even for the promise of being loved. What most people miss is not what changed in Michael, but how long that change was actually happening without anyone noticing. It did not begin at 62. It started years earlier, quietly, in moments that looked insignificant from the outside. A canceled plan that felt like relief instead of disappointment. A night alone that felt better than a crowded room full of conversations that went nowhere. A growing awareness that the version of himself he brought into relationships was not the same man he was when he was by himself. When he was younger, he expanded his life through people. New connections meant new energy, new stories, new possibilities. He would stay longer than he should, explain more than he needed to, and give more than he ever got back, because he believed that was what made something real. But over time, something subtle shifted. He stopped measuring relationships by how they began and started measuring them by how they made him feel after the initial warmth faded. And that is where the pattern became impossible to ignore. The tension that slowly replaced ease. The expectations that quietly replaced appreciation. The feeling that he was always adjusting, always accommodating, always managing something just beneath the surface. So when someone like Sarah came into his life now, kind, attentive, and present, he did not just see who she was. He saw what it might eventually become. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because he had lived long enough to recognize how often things change once comfort turns into routine. And for the first time, instead of leaning in, he paused. There was a time when a spark of connection would have pulled Michael forward without hesitation, when curiosity would have outweighed caution, and he would have leaned into the unknown just to see where it could go. But now, what stands out to him is not the spark, it is the aftermath that usually follows it. He has learned that excitement is loud at the beginning and quiet about its long-term cost. What used to feel like energy now feels like a signal, something that asks a question he no longer ignores. What will this require from me later? Because the truth he had to learn the hard way is that relationships rarely stay in their most appealing form. They evolve, they settle, they begin to ask for more time, more attention, more emotional availability, and eventually, more compromise than he once believed he could give without losing something essential in himself. Sitting across from Sarah at dinner, listening to her talk, he notices something he never would have noticed at 30. Not just her words, but the space between them. The subtle expectations forming before anything is even defined. The unspoken understanding that if this continues, it will grow into something that carries weight. And that weight is what he measures now. Not in a negative way, not with resentment, but with clarity. He is not asking whether she is good enough or whether the connection is real. He is asking something far more important to him at this stage of life. Will this add to the calm I fought to build, or will it slowly begin to take it away? And for the first time in his life, that question matters more than how he feels in the moment. What Michael remembers most clearly is not the beginning of those relationships, but how they felt months or years later when the initial warmth had settled into something heavier. It was never one dramatic moment that changed everything. It was the accumulation of small things that slowly reshaped his experience. The way a simple conversation could turn into a misunderstanding that lingered longer than it should. The way silence could feel tense instead of peaceful. The way he would sit in his own living room and feel like he had to measure his words, adjust his tone, or manage someone else's mood before he could even relax. None of it looked extreme from the outside. No one would have called it broken. But inside, it felt like a constant low-level pressure that never fully went away. And over time, that pressure became exhausting in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has not lived through it. Because it is not loud enough to demand immediate action, but it is persistent enough to drain you slowly. That is the part Michael carries with him now. Not bitterness, not anger, just memory. Memory of how easy it is for something that starts with connection to turn into something that requires constant maintenance. So when he looks at Sarah, he is not just seeing the present version of her. He is seeing the possibility of that same quiet weight returning. And what surprises him the most is not that he notices it, but how quickly his instinct now is to protect himself from it, even if it means stepping back from something that once would have felt worth the risk. Sarah was not the kind of woman who made things difficult. That was what made this harder to understand, even for Michael himself. She listened when he spoke. She remembered small details about his day, and she did not demand more than what was being offered. On paper, there was nothing to resist. In another phase of his life, he would have leaned into this without question, grateful for something that felt easy at the start. But what he notices now is not just how something begins, it is how it slowly evolves beneath the surface. He pays attention to the subtle shifts that most people ignore. The increase in frequency of messages, the quiet expectation of consistency, the natural pull toward deeper emotional involvement. None of these are wrong. In fact, they are what make relationships grow. But growth, to him now, also means weight. It means responsibility, adjustment, and a gradual shift away from the stillness he has come to depend on. What used to feel like connection now carries a second layer he cannot unsee. Every step forward is also a step into something that will eventually ask more of him than it does today. And the truth he does not say out loud is simple. He is not afraid of Sarah. He is not even afraid of caring about her. What he is careful about is losing the version of himself he fought to rebuild in silence. Because for the first time in his life, he is not trying to become someone better for someone else. He is trying to remain someone who finally feels at ease within his own life. The moment that changed everything for Michael did not come during a conversation or a conflict. It came in silence, in the kind of moment most people would overlook. After spending an evening with Sarah, he returned home, closed the door behind him, and stood there for a second longer than usual. No voices, no expectations, no need to explain where he had been or how he felt. Just the quiet hum of his own space. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down without turning on the television. And that was when he noticed it. Not happiness in the way he used to define it, not excitement or anticipation, but something steadier. His shoulders dropped. His breathing slowed. The tension he did not realize he had been carrying throughout the evening began to dissolve without effort. It was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. That feeling right there, that subtle return to calm, meant more to him than the entire night that came before it. And that realization unsettled him in a way he could not ignore, because it forced him to confront something he had never fully admitted to himself. The best part of his day was not connection. It was the absence of pressure. It was the freedom to exist without needing to respond, adjust, or perform in any way. Sitting there alone, he understood something with a clarity that only comes after years of living. He was no longer searching for something to add to his life. He was protecting something he had finally built, and that changed every decision that came after. What Michael begins to understand is something most people never stop to question. The idea that being alone must mean something is missing, that silence must be filled, that a life without constant connection is somehow incomplete. But his experience tells him something entirely different. When he sits in his living room with nothing but the ticking of the clock and the soft light coming through the window, there is no sense of absence. There is no urge to reach for distraction or to fill the space with noise. Instead, there is clarity, a kind of mental quiet that allows him to think without interruption, to feel without pressure, to exist without needing to explain himself to anyone. And that changes the definition of loneliness completely, because what he once feared as emptiness now feels like space. Space to breathe, space to reflect, space to simply be without expectation. When he looks back, he realizes that many of the moments he once called connection were actually filled with tension he had learned to ignore. Conversations that required careful navigation, emotions that had to be managed, and a constant awareness of how his words and actions might be received. That was never peace. That was maintenance. And now that he has experienced the difference, he cannot pretend not to see it. So when people assume he is isolating himself, they are measuring his life by a standard he no longer believes in. From the outside, it may look like he has stepped away, but from the inside, it feels like he has finally stepped into something that had been missing all along. What becomes clear to Michael now is not that relationships are wrong, but that they are no longer automatically worth the cost they once were. That is the part most people struggle to accept. They assume that if something is meaningful, it must be pursued, protected, and held on to at all times. But experience has shown him something far more precise. Meaning is not just found in connection. It is found in how that connection affects the quality of his life over time. He has learned to ask a different question than he did when he was younger. Not does this feel good right now, but what will this feel like 6 months from now when routines settle and expectations grow? Because that is where the truth always reveals itself. And for the first time, he is not willing to ignore that answer. When he thinks about Sarah, there is no resentment, no rejection, no sense that she has done anything to deserve distance. The shift is entirely internal. He simply recognizes that even a good connection can become heavy if it asks him to trade away the calm he now depends on. That is the standard he lives by now. Not perfection, not excitement, not constant companionship, but alignment with the life he has already built. If something fits into that life without disrupting it, he welcomes it. But if it begins to reshape it in ways that pull him back into tension, he steps away without hesitation. Because at this stage, preserving peace is not avoidance. It is intention. In the end, what defines Michael is not what he walked away from, but what he chose to protect once he finally understood its value. For most of his life, he believed that love required endurance, that staying was a sign of strength, and that giving more would eventually create something lasting. And for a long time, he lived by that belief without questioning it. But time has a way of revealing the difference between what sounds right and what actually works. What he sees now is not a failure of connection, but a shift in priority that only comes after years of experience. He does not see himself as someone who lost interest in relationships. He sees himself as someone who learned to recognize when something costs more than it gives. Sitting in his quiet home, there is no sense that he is missing out on life. There is no feeling that something essential has been taken from him. Instead, there is a steady awareness that he is finally living in alignment with himself. No tension to manage, no expectations to meet, no need to be anything other than who he is in that moment. And that clarity changes everything. Because once a man understands that peace is not the absence of something, but the presence of something real and hard-earned, he stops negotiating it away. Not for excitement, not for familiarity, not even for the promise of love. And from the outside, that decision may look like distance. But from where Michael stands, it feels like the first time his life truly belongs to him.